Okay, then. Good morning, good day to everyone. Good evening for those who are on the other side of the world. For those that were listening beforehand, Eileen had asked Sister Claire about her responsibilities, and the community she was very humbly talking about is a community of sisters that live in a little village next to Taizé. Many of you know about the name Taizé from my stories over the years. So welcome, and we want to congratulate the sister on her ordination, I think is the correct name, or the initiation.
Final profession.
Profession. Okay, so congratulations. That was I think in January.
February, yeah.
We missed you for a year while you were busy with those sisters, but now you can give us your full attention. We appreciate it. Great to have you with us. And this is a group for those who are just joining for the first time. We're a group of people from all over the world, literally from all over the world, from France, who we just heard, from Mauritius, off the coast of Africa. But we're centered in Palm Springs, California, in the desert. We are a very, very open and welcoming Jewish congregation with no building on purpose, with lots of stuff online, with study, with worship, and with social justice work. And we welcome everybody with us who's here today, Jew, non-Jew, whoever they may be. We're here to study a little bit from the Talmud. And what we're studying, as I introduced last week, is the section of brachot, which literally means blessings, having to do with laws and stories, as we'll see even today, hopefully, and ideas about prayer, in this case today about blessings, looking around the world and being mindful. This is an early form of Jewish mindfulness, saying blessings. These are not the blessings over a mitzvah, over doing a commandment. Those are in different chapters in this tractate called Brachot in the Babylonian Talmud. It's not the blessings over eating and smelling, the Birkot HaNehanin, the things from which we derive physical benefit. That's in another section as well. This is not the section of the Amidah that was raised last week, which is the silent and also out loud, depending on the community and the time in history, prayer that is said, the kind of one of the central prayers that's said 3 times a day in Jewish tradition. There may be things that come up that connect with the Amidah, but those things are covered in different chapters. We are not starting from the beginning of the tractate of Brachot, as I mentioned last week, because it's really complex. It starts with, from what point in the evening can one say Shema Yisrael, the evening recitation of Shema. From what point in the evening does that happen? Then it goes on from what point in the morning. Very, very tricky stuff, very confusing stuff. I've chosen instead a chapter that I think is easier to follow, especially for those for whom Talmud is something new. And with every chapter and every section, larger section of Talmud, there is a smaller section of the Mishnah, that is the oral traditions that were edited in the early part of the 3rd century in the northern part of the land of Israel, in the Galilee. And then afterwards comes a discussion, which was also oral for hundreds of years and then written down around 600 maybe, I don't think we know exactly. And it's a discussion that takes place both in the land of Israel and in Babylonia. We're in the Babylonian Talmud, so that gives us a particular perspective. There is a tractate of Brachot in the Jerusalem Talmud. We may look at it from time to time in a parallel passage, but that's not our focus. The Babylonian Talmud, again, as I mentioned last week, was the central work that influenced what we call today normative Judaism, even liberal Judaisms that sprung up in the last 200 years. But certainly traditional Judaism that became before that. The Babylonian Talmud had far more influence than the Jerusalem Talmud, which is not from Jerusalem, it's from the land of Israel, from Tiberias. It had, for various reasons that historians have worked on and explained, but I'm certainly not an expert, and I couldn't tell you why it happened that way. The geopolitics of the diaspora and how it happened. But what we'll see today already are multiple generations in conversation with each other. As I mentioned, it's kind of like the 3-dimensional chess game that Spock plays in the early Star Trek, and you see from time to time referenced in other TV and movies. It's complex, it's interesting, it's impossible, it's unrealistic, and yet it is very much who we are as a Jewish people. This ongoing conversation, this ongoing dialogue, or multilogue, as I like to call it, of people. It's never one person alone. Certainly no, it's never two people in conversation. It really isn't, because there's that one person and everything that came before her, and there's the other person and everything became before him and what's in their heads. There's always multiple participants. The interesting thing about what we're doing now in the last few years, and some of us even beforehand, using Zoom, is that it gives a different aspect to how we have a conversation. We have a conversation, and right now we see a few names, but mostly faces. Some of the faces are live, some are pictures. I'd encourage people, if they can, we don't care about your haircut or your makeup or you're wearing pajamas, whatever you do. It's nice to see people's faces and have that kind of conversation, that multi-log with everybody when we get to the discussion parts. But we see it in a different way than we do when we're in a classroom. Certainly the traditional classroom, which was row by row. Somebody asked, by the way, last week what that looked like, and I said, I don't know much, but I do remember a tradition about a certain rabbi who was able to move up in the rows. The important students were in the front rows. That's everybody seeing the back of the person in front of them. That's not the same as us seeing each other. It's kind of like sitting in a circle, sitting around a table, but even square tables, of course, have that limitation. So we began the Mishnah in this particular chapter of the Talmud. The first Mishnah is really long. It's not that the Mishnah, again, Mishnah is used as the term for the collection, as a literary composition, which is huge, 6 orders, and I sent that out last week, just a diagram of that. We're not going to go over that today again, but if you'd like to, you can reference it. And by the way, everything we do, we record, and will be up, maybe not that day of the next 2 days, but within the next few days, will be up on our site, and you can review that recording if you missed one of our classes for the next Thursday. So the Mishnah is the collection of these traditions, but also that word confusingly is used as a paragraph. In those collections, there's tractates, there's orders, which are 6 orders. There's tractates, multiple tractates. I don't know how many, 60, 70, whatever they are. And then in each tractate is broken down into chapters, and chapters are broken down into Mishnayot, or Mishnahs, right? So a Mishnah is a paragraph. I would say, from a pedagogical point of view, I probably shouldn't use that. It's just confusing. But I've been, some of us have been looking at a Talmud for many, many decades, and it's hard to disconnect ourselves from our own literary traditions and our own pedagogical traditions. And I think there's also something important that as well. It brings us in touch with other people who are studying Talmud. A final word about the study of Talmud. There are lots of groups in the last few years of what's called Daf Yomi, a page a day of the Talmud. It's a 7-year cycle. I've never done it. I've never really been attracted to do it, because to my mind, it's impossible to get very much out of a page of Talmud in one day. But that's because I'm limited. There are people that have been studying Talmud for years and years and years who get a tremendous amount from it. And after they finish the 7-year cycle, they have a better feeling for what's around in that whole field, or as we say, that whole ocean, Yam HaTalmud, the whole ocean of Talmud. So my thing is more biblical literature. I've focused most of my classical study on that. That in recent years, I'm trying to expand my horizons to living in these United States in the last 8 years. Native American issues, African American issues. Before that, it was addiction. I have other interests, and Talmud is not my main interest. So for those for whom Talmud is their main interest, to do that 7-year cycle gives them a feeling of hovering over all of it and saying, oh, I remember that. But there's really no way to go deeply into anything if you're going to do an entire page. A page means 2 sides of a page in the Talmud, a day, especially if you're only going to devote an hour to it. I don't in any way negate that practice. I encourage anybody to do it, to give it a try. There are a number of forums online that I've seen that do that. But this is not going to be that. This is far more of a deeper dive. As most of you who know and have studied with me know, that's kind of what I enjoy the most, and I enjoy facilitating with others is the deeper dive. Okay, so let's go back to the page that we started with last week. And that'll happen from time to time, but we won't finish an entire page. We were doing the Mishnah, there was a longer introduction, and we got as far as blessing the good things as you bless the bad things. We talked about Shechianu, that many of us know if we grew up in the Jewish tradition, the ultimate blessing of mindfulness, that we're thanking God for being in this place at this time. And we also talked about giving a blessing, thanking God for bad news as well when somebody dies. Baruch Dayan Hamet. So if you look on the first page, we're in the paragraph that begins, and one who cries out over the past. We're going to begin with that one. And if I could ask Steve Skopas if he would read, and if that's it's 4 paragraphs down on the first page that went out yesterday, that's titled at the top, Babylonian Talmud Brachot, chapter 54a, 55b.
Okay. And one who cries out over the past, it is a vain prayer. For example, one whose wife was pregnant and he says, may it be God's will that my wife will give birth to a male child, it is a vain prayer. Or one who is walking on the path and he heard the sound of a scream in the city and he says, may it be God's will that this is not from my house. It is a vain prayer.
Any thoughts or impressions? A vain prayer would be a waste of time, and maybe even taking God's name in vain. If you say a prayer and you say God's name, Adonai, but and you're walking, and why is this different than giving thanks for hearing the bad news that somebody's died? Or giving thanks on the other side that something's happened. Why? What's the difference between the two? Anybody?
It's that idea that you hope it's not me, or you don't want, you hear something bad or something that you don't really want, and you're giving thanks for, thank God it's not me that had that problem or that wrong outcome.
So is it the egocentrism that bothers, that gets in the way? Is it because it's about me?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it.
There's something about playing God in here too. Like, may it be God's will. It's almost like, if I were God, then, I wouldn't do this to me.
Maybe. Oh, that's interesting. So that's the English translation of Yehi Ratzon Milfanecha. Yehi Ratzon Milfanecha is more like, may it find favor in your eyes, God. That would be in the biblical language. It would be more what you would know. May we find favor in your eyes, Lord, and therefore would you do this? It's the would. It comes across far more brusque here in the English translation that it's meant to be. It is meant to be much softer, as a plea, as a petition to God, not telling God what to do, but definitely asking God to do something that's in your own interest. But one of the main differences between this, aside from it being very egotistical, but we're going to see the egocentrism will come up again because we talked about when you're in a place where a miracle happened. When we get to the Talmud, the Gemara, which is the later part of the Talmud, the earlier part, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and I'll explain it again when we get there in a few minutes, is going to talk about the tension between the public sphere and the personal sphere. So that's one aspect. Can Rita Claire?
I was going to say, I think to me the difference is, instead of praying to God that the baby will be healthy, they're going beyond that and being selfish about it, and specifically asking for a male child instead of being satisfied that they're going to have a child.
Right. So you and I feel it that way about it, especially you with the amount of children that you had in your life, and all those children that produce children, that produce children, and will continue to produce children. Rita Claire is a very active great grandmother. Not that she's still active in it, but it's by extension, of course. And But and so, yeah, you and I would say that, but the Jewish tradition, as many older traditions, certainly pre-feminist traditions, pre-20th century, remember, it wasn't that long ago that women didn't vote in this country, et cetera, is that it really was about having a male son. So I don't think the Talmud has an issue with that. I think the Talmud may have an issue, or the Mishnah may have an issue with the egocentrism here, but there's another issue here, and that is that it's already happened. In Yiddish, we'd say helft nicht, it won't help. What's happened has happened, right? So you know that you know, you're walking towards your house and you see a pillar of smoke up that, and you're saying, oh, just, you know, I hope that's not my house that's burning. Well, it doesn't matter. That's a wasted prayer, because either your house is burning or it's not burning. It's already, whatever is happening is already happening. If you say, I hope that fire doesn't spread to my house, okay, maybe we have the ego, we have the selfishness aspect of it. But if you say, I hope what I'm seeing is a dream, is an optical illusion, that is the opposite. If these blessings are meant to bring us in touch with reality and understand what's happening this way, horizontally, with how we believe, and this is said from faith, right? How we believe theologically, vertically, between, you know, combining this world and thanks with what we feel, what we perceive to be above, of course, is not, then just metaphorically speaking, then okay, but this is a disconnect from that, because this is already happening. To pretend this is not happening, or to hope it hasn't happened, that's not a correct prayer, says the Mishnah. I think it's an important aspect of, it says a lot about both on the level of selfishness and also on reality. What is reality? All right, now let's take a deep breath. What do we do about it? Yes.
Okay, I just had one more question about this one. Is what about after the fact? So you have a son and the baby was just born, and you say, you know, thank you, God, that I had a boy instead of a girl, or is that still vain?
So here's the thing, that, you know, the Talmud is the Mishnah is the beginning of the Talmudic discussion. This discussion goes on for hundreds of years. Then it's disseminated to different parts. Some of it stays in the land of Israel and Egypt. That's kind of one area. And Rome, you know, that connection that I mentioned, special connection between Rome and the land of Israel. The rest, the center, at least the way our history, the history we have is recorded, it is in Babylon, the Babylonian rabbinic community. Their influence goes across. With time, every few hundred years, somebody codifies the law. And I don't always remember exactly what level is. I usually remember what the difference between biblical and Talmudical. And I'll know the difference between Talmudical and what was decided in the Middle Ages. But that's an introduction to tell you that I'll tell you what the Orthodox halacha is today. When a son is born, you say, now I'm confused. Hatov v'hametiv or shechianu?
I think it's
so now I'm confused. I used to know this down pat, but for one, you say the blessing Hatov v'hametiv, for good, and thanking God who is good and spreads goodness into the world. And for the other one, you say, well, thankfully we got to this day. I mentioned recently, I don't remember if it was in this framework, that there is a Mizrahi Sfaradi custom of Zevet Habat, a celebration of the birth of a girl, unlike in Ashkenaz where there was nothing formal, just the celebration of a boy with a brit, with a circumcision. And in the end of that prayer, at the end of that customary prayer of Zevet Habat, it would say, you know, thanking God for this happening, whatever, and may the next baby be a boy. That's the. So the blessing Hatov v'hametiv is for a son, and Shechianu is for a girl, right? It's kind of, in this case, in this context, it's second best. But I want to get onto the Talmud today, so I'm going to speed us through this. And Harold, if you'd read the next paragraph for us, please.
Okay. One who enters a large city, one recites two prayers, the first upon entrance and one upon his exit. Ben Azai says 4 prayers, 2 upon entrance and 2 upon exit. One gives thanks for the past and cries out in prayer for the future. Okay, so there are 3 things that have been said here. One is said by the
regular author, the generic speaker in the Mishnah. We call that person, we call that voice the Tanakama, the first one who gives an opinion. There's lots of, is it Rabbi Meir? Is it others? I'm not, again, that less concerns me, but that kind of says this is like, it feels to me like this is majority of people say. And then there's somebody who gives a dissenting view. Now, the dissenting view here is not that different, right? A dissenting view is given by Ben Azai, whose full name is Shimon Ben Azai, the 2nd century in the land of Israel, like many of the sages that are quoted in the Mishnah. And he's only known by Ben Azai. Many of these rabbis, they have a kind of a nickname. Supposed to many of them have their first names. In this case, he's only called the son of Azai. And so he says there's 4 prayers, 2 upon entries, 2 upon exit. Doesn't go into detail here. The detail will come in another place. But it was more about there seems to be an issue of going into a city and leaving a city as opposed to being in the countryside. We don't know what that is. Does it have to do with Roman culture, with the fear of Roman society? Does it have to do with crime in the city? Does it have to do with when you're out in the countryside or in the village, you have a more puritanical or a more pious way of living, and when you get to the city, there's all sorts of challenges. There's women, there's business. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's the Mishnah isn't interested in further discussing this, but adds one more thing. It says in general, you should know in prayer that in the same way that there was a general rule beforehand, that in the same way that you bless for something good, you bless for something that's bad. Same thing here. You give thanks for things that are in the past, and I would say in the present as well as implied there. But you only cry out a petition, crying out a request only has to do with the future, right? Because you cannot change reality. So it's kind of summing up, and somehow that's connected to the prayer of going into the city, leaving the city. The Talmud will have to wait for another time for the Talmud to explore that even greater. So what we're seeing here, and we're halfway through the Mishnah, is the Mishnah throws out these traditions. In many cases, the Talmud has nothing to say about it because it's clear or because they didn't care. It wasn't relevant, or because we lost that section. Let's remember, we have are written recordings of what people said over hundreds of years in different places, in dozens of different places, right? So and there were people who were charged, had good memories, were charged with that mnemonic task of getting everything straight. There would be people that would pass those oral traditions down until somebody said, you know what, it's getting too mixed up, we need to write it down. But even when it was written down, we don't have the manuscript from the 7th, 6th, 7th century, 8th centuries. The earliest manuscripts we have in the Talmud, I think, are the 11th centuries, the 10th, 11th, again, not my expertise. And manuscripts don't match each other. As those of you that are coming from New Testament studies, you know that about Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. There's many different families and different chains. So and even in Hebrew Bible, right? There's a difference between what we find in the Greek translation of the Septuagint and what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes, and even in what we call Masoretic texts that are still part of that family of the Hebrew text that more normative Judaism has been using for 1,000 years. There are differences, not great differences, but differences in spelling or vocalization, things like that. Okay, let's go on. Steve Byrne. We're at the top of the second page.
Okay. Have to blow it up here. One is obligated to recite a blessing for the bad, just as one recites a blessing for the good, as it is stated, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Deuteronomy 6:5. With all your heart, with your 2 inclinations, with your good inclination and your evil inclination, with all your soul, even if God takes your soul, and with all your might, with all your money. Alternatively, with all your might, with every measure that God metes out to you. Thank God. Okay, so going to words that are very familiar in the Jewish liturgy, they're part of the Shema.
the 2 times a day recitation of Shema, for some even 3 times a day, and also well known because from a Christian point of view, this is the extension of what most people remember, ve'ahavta et Adonai, ve'ahavta, and you shall love, the two-prong quote of you shall love your fellow human being and you shall love God. But then it goes, how shall you love? That's the part that perhaps is less known in places. And then it goes into this is a typical example of a Tanaitic midrash. Midrash is the squeezing of the text for more information. We'll leave it at that for now. And Tanaitic refers to this period of time, the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, are the time of the Tanaim. The Tanaim are those that orally repeated the traditions. We call all these rabbis that we're meeting here, they're Tanaim. Later on, we'll meet another era of rabbis called the Amoraim, and they come from the time of the Gemara. So it's up to the beginning of the 3rd century, and from the beginning of the 3rd century to the 6th century, more or less. Those are the 2 groups. And here, this is a good example of how the Midrash works. It looks at the words, and not only is every word important and needs to be squozen for meaning, even a word that has 2 letters that seem to be redundant. So, for instance, that's what's behind, Steve, when it says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. The Hebrew is b'chol levavcha. So those that know Hebrew know that a heart is lev, but a poetic and older way of saying lev is levav, right? It's a fancier way of saying by doubling the bet. So when it says b'chol levavcha, you could say literally it means with all your heart, and that's all it means, right? But the Midrash, the rabbis might say, no. If there's 2 bets there, levavcha, that must be there's 2 of something. What do you have 2 of? Every human being has, and this turns out to be a really important notion in Jewish philosophy, theology, is that every person has in them 2 inclinations, 2 sides of them, the evil inclination and the good inclination, and the kind inclination. Yetzer hatov v'yetzer hara. The way to think of it is the animated angel and devil on the shoulders, telling us what to do, pulling at our ears. So that's when it comes to b'chol levavcha, the hearts. When it says, why does it need to say soul after heart? It basically says the same thing. No, even if your soul, your life is threatened. So from a psychological point of view, you've got to love God with what you tend to do in a positive way, even what you tend to do negatively. That's the first section. Then, even if you are going to give your life because of your belief in your love of God, as was the case under the Romans in a certain period, right? The martyrdom of some of these rabbis that are mentioned in the Mishnah. And then finally, with all your might, what is might? Your money. So your psychology, your body, your life, and your possessions. And then somebody says, now we know a different tradition. That's the alternatively. Now, does the alternatively mean that was said orally as this tradition was passed down before it was written down? Or does it mean that somebody was writing down and said, well, I remember it a little bit different. With all your might, no, that's with every measure that God metes out to you. Right? It's the one that becomes the normative understanding, by the way, is with all your money. You've got to dedicate your money. So the example that I would give the kids when I had a bar mitzvah class, most of you know that I lived most of my life in Israel, and I was a rabbi in Jerusalem. I was a rabbi in Tel Aviv, and in Jerusalem, I used to use the city every 6 weeks. We'd go someplace in the city as part of in the bar bat mitzvah class, and I had a big class every year. And I would take them before Passover, Pesach, to Mea Shearim in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, because I had connections there with the matzah bakery. And they would let us come in. They would show the kids how the matzah was made, handmade, let them taste freshly baked, handmade matzahs, a month before Pesach. And I would take them other places, and we'd go in front of a store, and there would be a store of Judaica with all sorts of silver Chanukiot, Hanukkah menorahs, and candlesticks for Shabbat, and spice boxes and things, and on some of them there would be a price, and somebody says, whoa, they'd spend 2,500 shekel on a spice box? Well, yeah, it's made from silver and whatever thing. And they said, well, why would they spend so much money on it? I said, I would turn to the kids, and this happened every year. The same conversation. I didn't plan it, right? The kids would say, I'd say, what do you spend in your family 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 shekel on? And they say, well, we don't know. But I said, well, how about your TV set, your stereo equipment, right? Maybe your car. How much is your car? How much is the video games that you have? Right? I said, it's all a question of where you're going to put your money. That to me, that was like, this is their understanding is with all of your ma'od, with all of your everything, with all of your money as well, right? It all depends where you're going to put your money. Okay, and I'm sure we could find apt parallels to that in the church world as well. Okay, all right. Comments or questions before we go on?
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of how, because I am confused here, can you give an example of how one loves God with your evil inclination?
Okay, good question. I think even when you are being affected by your evil inclination, right? Not just when you feel pious, but also when you really want to smoke that cigarette on Shabbat. I'm trying to give a non-challenging, or when you really want to eat that pie, or no, what would be a thing? Well, smoking a cigarette on Shabbat, you really don't want to, put on tefillin that day. You really, that you feel, yeah, do it even when your evil inclination is trying to get the best of you. I think that's how I would understand this.
So in a sense, is it to sort of stop yourself from doing it?
Yeah, well, stop. It's either do something. It's not just stopping yourself from doing something forbidden. It's do something that you don't feel like doing. It's both ways. It's psychological. Now, there is an issue that comes up in again, not my expertise, but in some forms of Hasidic literature that based on or has its roots in Sabbatean. In Shabtai Tzvi, not Shabtai, Shabtai Tzvi world where Avira l'shem mitzvah, maybe a transgression in the name of a mitzvah, something like that. In other words, there's certain things that you do that might appear to be done with your Yetzer Hara, with your evil inclination, but really it's for the good of heaven, for the sake of heaven. Not my expertise, and that may not be applicable here, but that kind of pops into my mind. Anything else? Okay, Sister Clara, would you read the next paragraph for us?
Sure. One may not act irreverently opposite the eastern gate of the Temple Mount, which is aligned opposite the Holy of Holies. One may not enter the Temple Mount with his staff, his shoes, his money belt, or even the dust on his feet. One may not make the temple a shortcut to pass through it, and through an a fortiori inference, all the more so, one may not spit on the Temple Mount.
Okay, so we've moved from things that are happening to one's life to where one is. We've kind of gone back to it. If you'll remember that the Mishnah began with when you see a place of miracles. So there's a geographical aspect to this of where you are, a spatial aspect. You're at the temple, for example, here, right? Now, does this mean just the temple means the temple in Jerusalem, right? The fact that there are synagogues called temple, that is a development of the 19th century. Before that, people did not call synagogues temple. In fact, calling the synagogue temple in the Reform movement was very much trying to move the focus from any thought of going back to those days of the temple in Jerusalem and offering sacrifices with priests, etc., all that kind of stuff, and saying, no, this is the new form of worship, and a way, what became in the 20th century a way for Orthodox and even conservative Jews on the East Coast to speak disparagingly of Reformed synagogues was to call them the temple. That's a temple. When I was growing up, you already started to have on the East Coast conservative synagogues that had the title temple, but not on the East Coast. That was on the West Coast. On the East Coast, that was very much a thing. Now today, it's mixed. Although you will not have an Orthodox synagogue that is called temple so and so. And if you do, if that does happen, my guess would be it was once a Reformed synagogue that turned into an Orthodox synagogue. But coming from the Orthodox world, we say the temple, there was only one temple. There aren't multiple temples. So the Temple Mount on Jerusalem, you're there, and there's an ongoing debate whether this. First of all, let's start the first thing. Even opposite the gate, the gate where is opposite the Holy of Holies, you've got to behave yourself. So it is the idea that perhaps God is more present there. Is the idea that you have respect for a historical place. It could be all these things together. It could be that there's still residue of God's presence in that particular place, especially the place that has a clear vision line when the gates are open to the Holy of Holies. The second paragraph has to do with going through the Temple Mount, and then there's a debate amongst commentaries. Does this apply to when the temple is standing? Which seems to be yes, that's something. But the novel thing here is even when the temple is destroyed, you can't go to that temple area in this way. And this has implications today for those Orthodox people who are the minority of Orthodox Jews who believe you can go to the Temple Mount. They happen to be very vocal, but most Orthodox Jews will not go onto the Temple Mount. And a lot of it has to do with the beginnings of this Mishnah here. Just a moment, Ella. And it's not just going there with your staff, your shoes, and your money belt, your backpack on, so to speak. It's kind of like take what I would say, people that are that keep their coats on and their hats on, especially guys that keep their hats on in restaurants and nice restaurants. It's just not. Right? To me, it feels disrespectful. To me and Tony Soprano, by the way. There was a great episode once with that. And then it's not only that, but you can't make it a shortcut. And then comes that tricky thing with the Latin phrase that's in Hebrew for those no kal v'chomer. And if you can't go do these things in the temple, if you can't pass through the Temple Mount using it as a shortcut, then all the more so you can't spit in that place as well. Ella.
Wouldn't it be also where God says to Abraham, I think, take off your shoes because the place where you're standing is holy?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so, which is something we don't do in our tradition so much. You know that from Muslim tradition and perhaps other faiths as well, where you do take off your shoes in the house, in the temple, or in your home as well. It's not always has to do with schmutz on your feet. It has to do with a certain kind of respect in Japan as well. And yeah, let's leave it. Yeah, I'm tempted to go different places, but yes. Anything else on this section? I'm kind of trying to push ahead, so at least we can say we did a little bit of the Talmud today. Okay, Eileen.
The conclusion of all blessings recited in the temple, they would say, "Blessed are you, Lord, God of Israel, until everlasting." When the Sadducees strayed and declared that there was but one world, they instituted the one recites, "From everlasting to everlasting."
Okay, so Haulam, it has to do with the Hebrew, and the text doesn't say, by the way, the Sadducees. That's given as an understanding because of other recorded conversations between Pharisees and Sadducees, which aren't very many in Talmudic literature. Many of you know those terms from the New Testament. It's a conversation about, is there a world to come or is there not a world to come? Is there a resurrection of the dead? Is there not resurrection of the dead? The Sadducees were very clear about, no, this is all, what's in front of you is what you got. This is the world. The Pharisees were, no, there's another world beyond this, whatever it was important to. And I think the important part here is not exactly the words, but how that theology, those competing theologies or philosophies, they affected what was the practice in the temple itself. So this purports to be an older tradition. If these things were written down to the beginning of the 3rd century, right, this goes back to before 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. And we have, as many of us as a group in other forums, have looked at big chunks of the Mishnah that seem like they're talking about something that was happening in the temple. They're older traditions. right? From the first half of the first century CE. So this is, I think the only thing I'd like us to remain with this here right now, is that of course the theology has affects what your liturgy is going to be, and that's something that's going to go through this entire chapter, goes through the entire tractate of brachot. Theology affects your liturgy. Liturgy affects your theology. I say this because in many communities, maybe also in more traditional Christian communities, but certainly in Jewish communities, and even in Reform Jewish communities, where ostensibly it's supposed to be more liberal, people continue to use words in Hebrew which do not reflect in any way what they believe. And so it became my creed already when I was in rabbinical school, was changing prayer liturgy, because once I realized that it'd all be changed, and none of this all this came together sometimes totally by accident because of the printing press, and before the printing press there were all sorts of different traditions of how one would pray, or there was far more flexibility. My creed became, I want to say what I believe and believe what I say, and that's not a given. There's so many people that will say things in the Jewish world in their prayer, the things that they don't believe, not only that are offensive. If many of you remember that when you first started to pray with me and you said, what happened to Aleinu? How come Aleinu l'shabeach, half of it is missing? Well, that's because the half of Aleinu, that's one of the final prayers in the liturgy, it speaks disparagingly about those who are not of the Jewish faith. I'm just not willing to do that. And it doesn't bother most people because most people don't understand the Hebrew. And sometimes those that understand the Hebrew say, yes, but that's our tradition. So it's paragraphs like this that I like to go to because it shows that no, when something is changed in belief, doesn't matter what the belief right now is, but something changed in belief, we need to change the words as well. But this leads into a very beautiful section of the Mishnah, which is not well known. Steve Kinney, would you read this section? I think you'll like this section in particular. We're in the last paragraph of that first.
David, I couldn't open that link that Madalena sent me, so I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, Megan, go ahead.
And they instituted that one should greet another in the name of God, as it is stated. And presently Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the harvesters, "The Lord is with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." And it says, and the angel of God appeared to him and said to him, "God is with you, mighty man of valor." And it says, and despise not your mother when she is old. One must not neglect customs which he inherits.
Okay, so let's hold up here. Just so it's a few things are going on here that we'll go back to it, Megan. The first one is when you say hello to somebody, use God's name. So I asked Steve to read this because in the church, of course, it's may the Lord be with you and also with you, right? So when Boaz, and the proof text here, and this is a great example of rabbinic literature that speaks out a particular law or custom and then gives the backup, the proof text, in this case, not from the Torah, but from the book of Ruth. And Boaz comes out to the reapers and he says, Adonai imachem. And they say, Yivarecha Adonai. They say it, God is with you and may God bless you. That back and forth using God's name. In other words, that's not in vain. This is a chapter about liturgy. You might think that you can only use liturgy when you have this formula, but it says no, even when you're greeting somebody, assuming it's a clean place and whatever, you're greeting somebody with God's name in it. Brings the proof text. Did anybody here grow up in Bnei Akiva like Sasha and I? I don't think so. Bnei Akiva is the Orthodox youth movement, Zionist youth movement that Sasha and I both belong to. And when you have the kind of the parade, the beginning of the meeting, you all stand in a big this, and you stand at attention, and they attention, like as if it's the army, because it's a youth movement, and they're very militaristic. And the head of the branch would come and say, Hashem imachem, didn't use God's name, but you say in Hashem imachem, and we all say Yivarech Hashem. What a wonderful thing to start your meeting, albeit militaristic, because it was a Zionist youth movement, but started using God's name. So the proof text is brought, and then what also happens, and we don't know, is this the original speaker? Did he bring two proof texts? Like the second text from Judges, it talks about the angel of God that says that God is with you. First of all, the first proof text is much more powerful because it's a human being talking to another human being outside of the realm of God in the field. So that really proves it. Then the second verse is less of a proof because it's an angel. No, an angel, that's the angel's job is to give the message from God. But then comes another verse from Proverbs. And that's why I included here the explanation in the square brackets that says, and despise not your mother when she is old. That, of course, is wisdom literature. You may not take your mother, your old, elderly, senile, Alzheimer, whatever mother seriously, but that is only used as a metaphor or a metaphor for respecting your customs, meaning to say that the time that this was said, somebody was raising their eyebrow and said, really, you're going to greet your fellow person in the street with God's name? And somebody saying back to them, yeah, let's respect the older customs, which I'm not usually one for, but in this case, I like that. Let's respect the older customs. But go ahead, Megan, there's another.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure. What you just said from Mishlei,
Yes.
to me, it made me think about what you just said about not reciting Aleinu L'Shavei Don HaKol.
Right.
Is that respecting the customs of our elders?
Right.
I just made me think of that when you said when we read that.
So good. So thanks for the comment, Malka. Yeah, there is a tension there. I like it here because it's something that is, because I like what's said before. And of course, I like things when I like them, and I don't like them when I don't like them. Right? It's I'm an expert picker and chooser, cherry picker. So yeah, the logic though is the same logic, Malka. People would say that you can't change the language of the prayer because that's what our ancestors did. But what set me free from that was. What set me free from that was, oh, by the way, the ideology is different though, Malka. In the Mishnah here, it's adding God's name in a place where God wasn't present. People saying, well, that's not really seemingly, that's not so much an ideology as much as a lack of comfort, I feel. But when it comes to an issue of disparaging other people in prayer or putting down women or God is a vengeful God towards the nations, those kind of things are ideologies, and what set me free, gave me the what's the word I'm looking for? The liberty, the agency, I guess. The agency to change liturgy was learning the history of liturgy, learning so that when we say our ancestors, in the Orthodox world, ancestors is very kind of, that's them. But when you get into the academic world of study of Jewish studies, you find out, well, there were very, very different, huge differences in groups between the different different ancestors that we had. Also, prayer has always changed with a change in ideology. The Aleinu prayer is a study in itself. Maybe another time we'll do it. Is a study in change in ideology. What most people pray Aleinu today is not, even in the Orthodox synagogues, is not the prayer which was done up into 100 and 150 years ago. It changed once Jews came into the Western world, and certainly not that what's done in conservative and some Reform synagogues is certainly what's not done in Orthodox synagogues. So I could say my ancestors, my parents were conservative Jews, liberal conservative Jews, so I could go there. Yeah, but that's a tension though, Malka. The tension is always going to be present. What's in the past and what's and what of that do we respect? And do we blindly respect it, or do we say no? We have the agency to change some of those things. I remember once I was in a conversation with an Orthodox feminist friend of mine who was not. If it had been 10, 15 years later, she would have studied, I think, for the Orthodox rabbinate. She's of the same people, but this was in the 90s. And we were talking about the Seder, the Passover Seder, and I explained to her how we don't say Shvo chamatcha al goyim, pour your wrath against the nations in our Seder. So she said, and here's a feminist, a woman who had just taken her head covering off. She'd worn her head covering when she was first married. She was involved she's very publicly involved in her own Jewish Orthodox community. And she looked at me, she says, Minhag avotenu biyadenu, right? Isn't our ancestors' custom in our hands? And I just looked back to her, I said, really? Minhag avotayich biyadayich? You're not doing what your mother did. You're not doing what your grandmother did. So everybody chooses the changes that they're comfortable with. But great question, Malkai. Thank you for bringing it up. So Megan, that last paragraph, please.
And lest you say that mentioning God's name is prohibited, it says, it is time to work for the Lord. They have made void your Torah. Rabbi Natan says another interpretation of the verse. Make void your Torah because it is the time to work for the Lord.
Okay, so this is on the same topic that we had just been talking about. Malka and I in our little it wasn't really an exchange because I took over and I didn't. Malka, I should have asked you, what did you want to respond to anything I said?
No, I'm good. Thank you. That was a great explanation.
Okay, so this is on the same topic. Somebody adds on here the words that, and by the way, and this is the same, or an answer to what you say, that you should respect what Boaz did, so to speak, by using God's name. Then somebody says, yeah, but eight lasot. It's time to change things because they are disrupting the Torah, and that could go either way. That eight lasot, it's a time to change, was the name of the journal of my rabbinical school, which was the Masorti Movement's rabbinical school. It still is, but that journal doesn't exist as far as I know. That started in the late 80s in Jerusalem, saying, look, the Torah is evaporating. Something needs to be done. And the way that we thought as students, the thing that needed to be done was to offer a new kind of liberal halachic Judaism, right? But you could say it that way, or then Rabbi Natan says, yeah, no, we use that verse for another purpose. And I'm going to read into this perhaps more than I should, because I didn't check to see Rabbi Natan's exactly where he lived and what was going on. But I could understand somebody saying, there's a war going on. No, that's not what I want to say. So now I don't, because I prepared this 2 weeks ago, I don't remember already what I wanted to say the second half here. So I'm welcome any interpretations. Anybody's got something. I should go back to the Hebrew. No, it has to do with cause and effect and cause. Let's go to the second page, because I decided that for sure we're going to at least start it today. And we go from the Mishnah, the older traditions, to a later conversations. And we can't expect things to be chronological here or geographical here. There are those that study those things to see how certain sections, we'll call them, they're called the sugya, a particular literary unit, how they've been edited in what ways. It's kind of beyond my expertise in Talmud. From time to time, perhaps I will share with you what I see in the research that I read. But here, all I see is one of the main rabbis of the Amoraic period, right? One of the main Amoraim, his name is Rabbi Yochanan. He is a land of Israel. He's a Palestinian, used in the older sense of the word, a rabbi, and yet he is extremely important in the Babylonian Talmud. He's also in the Jerusalem Talmud. But if everybody in the first section that we did in the Mishnah was living in the land of Israel, in this case, even it was living in the land of Israel. Now on the pages that come, we're going to see people, sages that are living in the land of Israel, but not predominantly, but quite a few who are living in Babylonia as well. In certain pages of the Talmud, it's only Babylonian sages speaking with each other. Okay, so let's go ahead with that. Malka, would you like to read this section, the first section? No. Okay. And Jackie?
I'm unmuted.
Go ahead,
Do I
Malka.
start from where are these matters derived?
Yeah, from the Gemara. The Gemara, as
Okay.
we said last week,
Right,
is
okay.
is the.
From where are these matters derived? Rabbi Yochanan said these verses states, quote, and Jethro said, blessed be the Lord who delivered you out of the land, out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians.
Okay, all right, so
Okay.
relating to the story, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who came to greet them right before the theophany at Sinai. And Jethro surprised us because he's a priest of Midian. He's not a priest of God. He's a different religion, different people, different religion. And he says, you know what? Praised is your Lord, Adonai, is God. Recognition, as some would say, that he was the first convert to Judaism or to the Israelite religion. Others would say it's Ruth. But by the way, in the church world, what I found once when I was doing some research in the church fathers, Jethro is not mentioned. Is certainly not praised. In the Western church fathers, in the Eastern church fathers, yes, and I think that has to do with perhaps the challenge of. I just think there was less animosity in those lands, in the Eastern lands, between Jews and Christians, as you can see from some of the Eastern church fathers. But back to this though, and I think possibly because of this danger of conversion I'm talking about much later Christianity than the Christianity we've been talking about in our study of the book of Acts. So what the Gemara, that is the Talmud, is doing here is asking the question of what is the proof text, whereas sometimes the Mishnah will bring a proof text, like it did in the latter part that we studied just a few moments ago. Very often it will not, and then the rabbis will bring somebody will bring a verse, and somebody else will say, well, no, that one I bring another verse, and they'll go back and forth, and the texture of that back and forth, the weaving back and forth, is this intertextuality, right? Of all the stuff comes together to give us a feeling, an idea of who we are as worshipers of God in the Jewish tradition. In this case, though, it's very straightforward. Where do we know that you see a blessing in a place of a miracle? That's what's implied here. And the story of Jethro is brought up as the proof for all that. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Any comments or questions?
David, I have a more general question that I think relates to that, but the back and forth, that I love that multi-log open-endedness. Is there a sense that in that back and forth, something new keeps emerging that then engages something else, or is it just a continual open-ended conversation with different accents and emphases?
I think both. Both and, right? It's that and the other. I think there is an ideology of let's talk Torah and let's go back and forth. It's like the rabbis sitting at the table at the Seder, and their students come in and say, hey guys, the sun has come up already. You've been talking all night long. That episode in the Haggadah that we read. That's kind of like talking about it for the sake of talking about it. That is our culture. That's what we do. That's our form of art. That's our form of spiritual presence. So there is something like that, right? I think it's Maimonides divides the 613 commandments, which nobody agrees. Everybody agrees on 613, but the different authorities over the years don't agree exactly on which are the 613, at least in the middle, up until the Middle Ages. And Maimonides, I'm pretty sure it's Maimonides, divides the commandment of study of Torah into two. One is the study of Torah for the sake of studying the Torah, for nothing else. The half of what you said before and what I just described, right? The joy of that back and forth. It's a form. It's an art form. It's a the intellectual back and forth. The other one is, says the Rambam, is studying Torah so you know what to do, how to live your life, and which is far more instrumental, right? One is altruistic, the other one's instrumental, if I'm using those words correctly, And so in this case, though, it's kind of like, one way of reading it is like, somebody says at some point, where are you coming up with this stuff from, right? There's nothing in the Torah that says to give a blessing, let alone say a blessing when when you pass by a place where miracles were done for the people. And so, no, they said, no, that's what we learned from this story here. I could imagine one of the students saying, totally speculative what I'm doing right now, right? Imagine the students saying, except for Rabbi, but wasn't Yitro non-Jewish, right? Why, he wasn't one of us, right? He wasn't an Israelite. Wasn't he a priest of Midian? And I could see the rabbi, because now I'm building on things that I know. When the rabbi said, no, it says priest, but that word there in that context means he was a leader. He was a political leader, wasn't a religious leader, to soften the blow of the other who comes to teach us our own tradition. But of course, the whole, and now I would say fast forward to the late 20th century when I first studied this in the university, that's the whole point of the story. The whole point of the story is to show that Moses got his Torah not just directly from God, but also from other sources, right? Know the truth wherever you find it, kind of a thing.
Nice.
Let's do one more paragraph. Whoever was reading, Malka, if you could read one more paragraph.
For a miracle that occurs for the multitudes, we recite a blessing. And for a miracle that befalls an individual person, we do not recite a blessing. Wasn't there an incident where a certain man was walking along the right side of the Euphrates River when a lion attacked him? A miracle was performed for him and he was rescued. He came before Rabbi, who said to him, every time that you arrive there, recite the blessing. But blessed who performed the miracle for me in this place.
Okay. Raising it, not a totally different topic, but until now, somebody said, okay, we understand for national, for public, for community kind of, that we understand that, but how about if it's something just a private thing? And instead of going for a verse, which might have been a way to do it, to tell us one way or another, it goes for a precedent, and the precedent is a story. And we're going to leave it up in the air right now. We're going to begin with this when we meet next week, but very often the precedent can be a verse. The precedent can be a legal opinion quoting somebody who came earlier. The precedent can be a story, and that's the case here. Sometimes the precedent is go out and see what the people are doing. That's not really the right way of using precedent, I think, but still, you understand the source. So what are the sources of practice of law? That's one of the questions that are going to be hovering. So I think we've done enough for today, and I was determined to get to the sheet. Keep these sheets. We're going to be doing them next week, and possibly I'll put out another sheet. I don't know. I may just leave this sheet so we don't get confused. I'll see you. Thanks for being here, and we'll see everybody next week. Please feel welcome to write me with any comments or questions. You can write to the info@Oramidbar, or there's some place, I'm sure, on whatever emails we get. You just reply to an email we send out, and the message will get to me. So thank you everybody, and let me just see if there's anything great. Okay, be well. Bye-bye.
Bye.